this. I want to share with you as I struggle here a little bit of my journey into digital tech and equity. As Jessica so graciously shared, I've dedicated my life to supporting farm workers and frankly, the essential women and men who feed us, be they here where I am in a hotel room in Watsonville, California, Baja California, Chile, wherever our food may comes from that we consume here in the United States. And in the course of my work, came to realize that in specialty agriculture, in the production of fresh fruits and vegetables, there is a huge paradigm shift underway. And more disturbingly, from my perspective, there's not an honest conversation about who the winners are going to be, and more importantly, who the losers are going to be. And so I'd like to do with you in the brief time that I have this morning, share that journey with you. I think it's really important to understand there is an absolute feeding frenzy going on in terms of deploying precision agriculture, digital technology in the production of our food system. This is the most recent graph I found about the number of different platforms that are being developed, all with the idea of deploying into agriculture. Now, one might think, well, this is just benign, helpful stuff that we could use to, as Samir, I think, talked about, to kind of feed the corporate narrative. What I want to do is follow the money and take a hard look at, well, who's actually funding this and who are the winners and the losers are going to be. And if you look down, and I randomly came across this conference and looked at, who are some of the founders of this and supporters? Bayer, Syngenta. For those of you in the organic movement, those names might be meaningful. Also, where I live in Eastern Washington, we have Microsoft based in outside of Seattle. We have Google, we have Amazon. And just to highlight, none of those are based in rural communities. So as we've already heard, there is a litany of market claims being made to farmers about the wonderful benefits of digital technology. These are some random ones I pulled off the web, talking about how you can increase your data entry in the fields, how you can better track pest management. Again, looks okay on the surface. What gets interesting is when you look at the investment side of things and their narrative of these same companies to investors. This is actually a page I came across pitching a robotic apple harvester, and where I live in the Tri-Cities, we're surrounded by tree fruit orchards, pears, cherries, and apples. So this one resonated. And note how it's talking about nearly all apples are harvested manually. Your labor costs are 60% of your production costs. And the punchline is you can make bank if you invest now. Now think about that, and I'm speaking particularly to the farmers in the room. I'm going to come back and speak from a worker perspective in a couple of minutes. Where do you think that money is going to come from? It's going to come from your orchards. And we know right now that the economics of agriculture production are tight, and it's a win-lose perspective. So the fact that they are talking about invest now and make bank means that money is going to come off of your farm. Not only is it going to come off your farm, but if you keep digging into the market claims, as I did, you come across what I would consider even more nefarious claims, where one incubator is openly talking about automating the entire food supply chain from seed to fork. Think about that for a moment. There is no mention of workers. There is no mention of growers. There is no mention of servers. There is no mention of chefs. They want to automate it. So underlying all of this, and if you have not seen this movie, I would encourage you to do so, is the issue of data. What I appreciated about this movie, and I had a tech specialist turn me on to this in Eastern Washington, this is the story that starts up in the Tehachapi Mountains of Southern California of some farmers back at the turn of the 20th century. None of their crops would grow. Everything they planted would die. And they realized when they looked in the soil, there was a noxious black ooze that would come out and kill everything that it came into contact with. The Daniel Day-Lewis character comes from the East, recognizes the plight of these poor suffering farmers and offers to buy their land from them. The farmers, thinking that he is a godsend, gladly sell their farms and feel they have now been released from the curse of being landowners in this useless part of California. What they did not realize is that what the Daniel Day-Lewis character was buying was the oil rights. And he would pay pennies on the dollar to secure property that would later generate millions upon millions of dollars. That is the ultimate goal of these companies. It is about data. And just as oil, it has no inherent value unless it's processed, other speakers, and I'm thankful to come in this order, have already spoken about the need to be able to aggregate large amounts of data and to have the ability to process that, find patterns that others may not have. So at play here is the deployment of this technology as data harvesting. So from my perspective, as I've followed the money, I would say that robotic harvester is as much about harvesting apples as Facebook is about connecting friends and family. It is a way to harvest tremendous amounts of data off of farms across North America, wherever the technology is being deployed, and that data is being given away for free. And it will be to the exclusive benefit of the companies who own it. Witness what's happening with John Deere, prohibiting farmers from repairing their own tractors because they are fearful that they will somehow interfere with the data collection that John Deere is engaged in. This will only grow if we do not take action. So remember, if there's one thing two things coming out of this presentation, data is the oil of the 21st century. If you do not know where your data is going and you're not getting compensated for it, you're giving it away for free and at your peril. A buddy of mine went to a grower buddy just down the road in Moss Landing, went to a symposium that Microsoft held that was talking about all of the wonderful things that they were doing with digital technology in support of agriculture. And there was a young man, clearly had no background in agriculture, that was presenting. And some of the farmers who were present were getting increasingly angry and insulted by his arrogance and condescension about how wonderful their technology is and how it superseded everything that people have been doing for generations. So finally, one of the farmers in the room just couldn't stand it anymore, stood up and just said, look, you think you know what you're doing. This farm has been in my family for generations. We know the microclimates, we know everything that's going on. I don't believe anything you're saying. The young man, kind of bored, looked at his watch, looked around the room, said, yeah, our data says we can outperform you by 20 or 30%. Any other questions? And it was at that point that my buddy, who was on the employer side of things, and I realized he owns a fleet of taxi cabs. I am on the union side trying to unionize the taxi cab drivers. And what we're not paying attention to is there is a fight for dominance of who is going to be the next Lyft and Uber in agriculture. And what we mean by that is who is going to have a monopoly position that will dominate the majority of data coming out and start dictating to farmers and by extension to farm workers what and how to grow. So I want to pivot for a second, and Samir this morning said some very important things, and I want to really dive into this now, and remember, technology is an exacerbator. And as Samir pointed out, agriculture in North America has deep, deep roots into racism. And at the beginning of the pandemic, many of us who've been supporting and advocating on behalf of farm workers felt a huge relief when farm workers were finally deemed essential. We have known this to be inherently true for decades, because without the sacrifice of what we now call these essential women and men, we would not eat. It is that simple. And so finally, there was an official determination that yes, farm workers are truly essential. And what happened was that very quickly turned into a curse. What we saw is farms across the country, and there are good examples to the contrary, but as an industry, we had system failure. There were no federal regulations requiring the use of masks, social distancing, the provision of hand washing facilities less than a quarter mile away, which currently is the requirement. To give you a sense of what that is, that's a little over 4 football fields. And as a result, workers paid with their lives. Not only did they pay with their lives, but because they had been deemed essential, they did not have the luxury to isolate in place. They literally had to go to work. They saw coworkers getting sick. They were not told what happened to those coworkers. Those coworkers would go away, and later they might hear there was a funeral for that coworker. No efforts were taken to isolate or protect the workers that were employed. A handful of states, and I'm proud to say the state where I live, Washington, did finally implement binding rules to protect farm workers from COVID, but even those rules were violated. And I want to share the story with the permission of his widow, Marcia, on the right, of Earl Edwards. Earl was a farm worker, a Jamaican national who had come to the state of Washington for about a decade to harvest tree fruit on a large farm in north central Washington. He became symptomatic with COVID. And since he was in this country with a guest worker visa, he did not have housing of his own. The employer put him into a labor camp and isolated Earl as he should. What they did not do was provide Earl with medical care. So Marcia, on a daily basis, would call Earl to check in on her husband to see how he was doing. And she told me that every day she called, Earl was worse. And she started getting fearful about what was going to happen to Earl. Earl finally collapsed, was evacuated to the hospital in an ambulance where he died. What makes this even worse is that 3 weeks earlier on the same farm, in the same labor camp, a worker named Juan Carlos Rincon, who was from Querétaro, Mexico, suffered the exact same fate. 2 workers were killed because of COVID. And I use that verb intentionally. Those of us who are parents reflect on this. If we have a child, as I do, who becomes symptomatic and we put her in a room and we fail to provide her with medical attention, I am not an attorney, but what I understand that to be is negligent homicide. And criminal charges, I believe, should flow, and I should be incarcerated for failing to protect my daughter. Yet because this was an employee-employer work relationship, there were no criminal charges. Marcia had to fight tremendously to just get the pension that she was due and never received a single word of condolence from the employer where her husband was killed. These are the abundant stories of essential women and men who feed us today. So now imagine that you see this website. I'm coming back to the robotic harvester. And you have been told you're essential, we need your work, you need to get out there and sacrifice, and thank you so much. And oh yeah, by the way, you cost us 60% of our production costs. You're going to go up another 70%. So we're just going to get rid of you and bring in a robotic harvester. I cannot think, well, I can, but things more offensive and deeply hurtful than this. The arrogance, the degree to which and the ease by which this community looks at farm workers, these essential women and men who have paid with their lives and their health, as disposable tools that can be replaced by robotics, and then you can make bank if you invest in it. How repulsive is that? And is that really the future we want in our agricultural system? Not only that, but there's a narrative, a false narrative about the jobs that will be created. These are some pictures from Pasco, Washington. The economy of Pasco is largely driven by agriculture production. You start replacing workers with technology, the money is not going to flow into these rural communities. It's flowing back to the investors who have invested in the technology. So don't believe this? Take a look at what's happened in the Midwest with the introduction of mechanization. You've had farmer suicide. You've had large-scale farmers economically failing. You've had concentration of land. You've had the decimation of dozens, if not hundreds, of rural communities as a result of the race to mechanize. Now, with technology as an exacerbator, we have this now becoming even more prevalent, and no one is having an honest conversation about the future of our rural communities. And if there's one thing I know for certain, Mabton, Washington is not going to see an infusion of tech jobs. It is going to be further economically decimated as the money is extracted from our rural economies, and our rural communities will pay the price. I want to take you very quickly down a part now on race and why, for me personally and us in the farm worker community, Black Lives Matters really speaks to us as a community and as individuals. If Black lives had mattered in the 1930s, farm workers today in the United States would not be in the position which they find themselves. There was a very openly racist narrative that happened in the US Congress when key labor legislation was being debated. The National Labor Relations Act, when it was enacted, explicitly excluded farm workers and did so at the request of primarily the white Southern senators who very clearly did not want the then Black shareholders, the sharecroppers of the South, to have any tools to effectively organize and exert their rights. As a result, where we live in the state of Washington and the overwhelming majority of the states, when workers want to exert their rights to unionization, there is no binding legal mechanism that allows that to happen. And the penalties they can, and the retaliation that workers face are severe, including up to firing and summary eviction from their grower provided housing. In many states, there are no, the Fair Labor Standards Act, when it was enacted in the 30s, explicitly excluded farm workers, again, for the same, my opinion, racist reasons. So in states across the country, workers do not have the legally guaranteed right to a paid break. Think about that. You are doing backbreaking manual labor. Is it picking strawberries, milking a cow, harvesting broccoli, and the law does not guarantee you a 10-minute break per 4 hours as every other worker in this country gets. Most workers do not get overtime as a result of this racist exclusion from the Fair Labor Standards Act. There's over 30 states in the United States that do not mandate workers' compensation insurance to cover a worker's injury if they get injured on the job. So racism infuses agriculture today. And if Black lives had mattered in the 1930s, we would be in a different place. Fast forward to 2015, the person holding the picture is Antonia Zambrano's daughter. Antonia Zambrano was a farm worker. He lived in Eastern Washington, about 20 minutes away from where I live now. And he got injured working in the tree fruit industry. And he was injured so badly, he wasn't able to work. And farm workers are tremendously proud people. They are proud of the work they do, feeding the world. They are proud of being in the fields and working with the land and the biological systems that are there. And when he could no longer provide for his family, he became emotionally despondent. And what is commonplace in the farm worker community is you might get medical attention for your physical malady, but the workers' comp system and our mental health system is not inclusive of treating your emotional state and what also suffers when you can be badly injured. So Antonio spun into a deep emotional dark place. And one day in the afternoon, he was walking through the streets of downtown Pasco, saw a patrol car, a Pasco police car drive by, bent down, picked up some rocks and threw the rocks at the patrol car. No longer had rocks in his hand, was walking away. The police officer stopped the patrol car, pulled his gun, and executed Antonio in the street with impunity. No charges were ever brought against that police officer. That is why Black Lives Matters to us in the farm worker community. If Black Lives Matter, Antonio would be alive today. So as we look at the deployment of technology, we have to be very aware of the legacy of racism and how it's being hardwired into technology. Thankfully, we stand on the shoulders of some incredible folks that have fast-tracked this conversation, such as the Algorithmic Justice League, who have looked into hardwired bias on gender, on race, and how technology and those writing the algorithms are putting that bias into the technology that they're deploying. This is a conference I just picked off the web and looked at, well, who's actually designing this? And I can tell you, after 30 years working in the farm worker community, none of these people look like farm workers to me. In fact, they look pretty much as different from farm workers as I can imagine. So one then is left questioning, well, where are farm workers in this conversation? And what we know, they're not at the table. And in fact, when we look at the folks who are actually designing technology, they appear to have forgotten a primary tenet that I believe should be fundamental to their work of do no harm. We only have to look at the Amazon distribution centers and warehouses where the data is showing us that where AI has been deployed, the injury rate of humans who are working alongside of it has skyrocketed. There is no consideration for workplace safety here. It's all about efficiency and productivity. And as Samir and others have talked about, subjecting human bodies to the support of that technology at the peril of those human bodies. From the grower side, I can tell you there is deep-rooted fear in the state of Washington about the future. This is a traditional orchard. This is what I would call, what we call a three-dimensional canopy. This is what a tree looks like. And right now, estimates are somewhere between 1/3 and to 1/2 of all the tree fruit industry is up for sale in the state of Washington because people know what's coming. If you are going to deploy what we call in our part of the world precision technology, your orchard needs to look like this: a 2-dimensional trellis that looks like a very tall grape vineyard, because the robotic harvesting, the technology cannot deal with the complexity of a three-dimensional canopy. To give you a sense, to replant this is going to cost somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 an acre. And then you have to wait 3 to 5 years for the trees to come into maturity before you're going to recoup your losses. So what we're seeing in an unprecedented way is that farmers of all sizes are selling out. The debt load of many producers is unprecedented since the 80s. They no longer have access to lines of credit through traditional lenders. So they're selling equity positions, partial or entire, to outside investors, such as the Ontario Canada Teachers Pension Plan, which now runs one of the larger orchards in our region. So quickly, I just want to wrap up. This isn't doom and gloom. In my journey being in support of farm workers, I have been humbled by their knowledge, by their passion, by their vision, by their hope. After this conference, I have the honor of going out into the fields again and being with these amazing women and men. They know what's going on in the fields. They know what is really happening. And so when I'm going to a strawberry field today, the owner is a nice guy. I'm going to talk to the workers if I really want to know what's happening. They also have tremendous creativity and thoughts about how work could happen better to enhance agricultural production, to make agriculture production truly dignified and supportive of their careers. So we've actually started working with farm workers to design, well, what would that look like? How can we help farm workers see themselves in this process, and not just as implements or disposable people that when robotics come in, you can get rid of, but as the drivers of true technological innovation that can enhance our rural communities, enhance agricultural production, but centering on the inherent dignity of farm work. Thank you so much.